retirement is going to last a long time. So your money might need to last for decades. And the other thing is that whilst we live longer, and that is always great news, people do tend to be iller for longer as well. So it's not just that we're going to need our money to last longer. We also need to look at whether or not we're going to need any care as we get a bit older. So there might be more people needing care, and you kind of need to factor all that in.
This episode is sponsored by Saxo Markets. Hello and welcome to the Investing Insiders podcast, where we help you achieve financial well-being by making smarter money decisions. I'm Brianne, and in today's episode, we'll be looking at how to prepare your finances for a longer life. With life expectancy on the rise in the UK, understanding how to prioritise and pace your money is becoming so much more important. Joining us today is a returning guest, Sarah Coles, who is Head of Personal Finance at AJ Bell. Sarah, it's great to have you back.
It's lovely to be back.
Amazing. Well, there's been some really interesting statistics that are out now from the Office for National Statistics about life expectancy. What have they revealed?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So one of the fun things that they've got on their website now is a life expectancy calculator. So it's a pretty kind of basic calculator in that you put in your age, you put in your, whether you're a male or female, and it will tell you roughly what you're expected to live to. So it told me I'm expected to live to about 87, which was excellent news for me. But it's by basically all the numbers that lie behind it, they've released sort of some of the details about how long people can expect to live more generally. So a girl born in 2024 in the UK has a life expectancy of 90 now. Now, boys tend to have lower life expectancies, but not massively so, but the boys will be expected to live to about 87. That is projected to increase. So they kind of built in a certain amount of, improvements in, things like healthcare and that sort of thing. So by 2049, life expectancy is expected to reach 92 for girls and 90 for boys. So those life spans that people can expect are getting a lot longer. And actually, loads more people are making it to 100 now. So roughly 1 in 5 girls and just over 1 in 10 boys born in 2024 are expected to live to 100. And that's going to rise. So it's expected to rise to roughly a quarter of girls and about a fifth of boys by 2049. So those the lifetimes that we look at, so what tends to happen is we think, when I retire, I'll probably live as long as my grandparents. It's going to look very different by the time we and our children kind of reach retirement.
It is fascinating. And to see that increase so much during our lifetimes, I guess the big question is, what does that mean for financial planning? Because I guess you can kind of map what a retirement would look like based on what you've seen before. But with these numbers increasing so much, how do you kind of plan for those life milestones, particularly retirement and things like that?
Yeah, so I think basically retirement is going to last a long time. So your money might need to last for decades. And the other thing is that, whilst we live longer, and that is always great news, people do tend to be iller for longer as well. So it's not just that we're going to need our money to last longer. We also need to look at whether or not we're going to need any care as we get a bit older. So there might be more people needing care, and you kind of need to factor all that in. The best way to do any of this is to use a pensions calculator. So we talk about using a calculator quite a lot when you're looking at whether or not you're building up enough. So you kind of put in, how much you're paying in at the moment, how much you've got so far, and when you expect to retire. And that will show you roughly what kind of pot you can end up with. But the other really important part of the calculator is that then it'll show you how long that money is likely to last. So you kind of put in roughly what you want to take each year, and it will say, either well done you're going to retire fabulously, or your money's going to run out before you do. And it's really important to kind of do those calculations, and then you can kind of make different choices as you get closer to retirement to think, okay, how do I make my money last a bit longer?
So when thinking about retirement, and say you go onto a calculator, how long roughly should you maybe plan on average for your retirement to last for? Is there a benchmark that we should all be thinking about? Or is it just, you just see how it goes?
Well, this is what's so difficult about retirement income planning, because, in order to do it properly, you really do need to know how long you're going to live. Yeah. And nobody does. So it's this whole it's the missing jigsaw piece that we're all kind of desperately trying to put this jigsaw together, and we're just, on a hiding to nothing. So you can look at some of the averages. So that Office for National Statistics stuff, it also looked at people who were age 65 in 2024. So they looked at those people and said, well, women of that age can expect to live another 22 and a half years, and men about 20 years. And then they sort of cast ahead So by 2049, women who are age 65 can expect to live about 24 and a half years longer, and men for about 22 years. So it's a rough rule of thumb. Obviously, it depends on, who you are. We find that, the life expectancies of people who are in wealthier areas are much, much longer than those who are in sort of less well-off areas. So if you know you're in relatively robust health, you've been doing all the right things in terms of looking after yourself, you need to plan for a longer retirement as well.
So I guess one of the things that might come up when hearing these statistics is, okay, well, if retirement is, technically extending and you might be able to kick it down the road a little bit, does that mean you can delay starting this process of making sure you have enough in your pension, or is it better to get started sooner?
It is a really good question because it's an easy assumption to make. You think, well, I'll just start a little bit later and we'll be fine. But actually, just because we are living longer, it doesn't mean that we are healthy for that period of time. So there are no guarantees you're going to make it to state pension age in decent health. And actually, new statistics have shown that in 9 out of 10 areas, people don't get to state pension age in good health on average. So you can't really guarantee that you're going to be in control of when you stop work. It's more likely that your health will be in control, and that will be the point at which, you need to stop working. So there's lots of people who say, I'm going to wait till I drop. I can't imagine retiring. I'm so excited by my wonderful job that I can't possibly ever leave. And that is brilliant to think. But in reality, it's just not how things happen for most people. So healthy life expectancy is actually falling as well. So we're living longer periods of that time we're not going to be able to work for. So it is worth, as you say, it's just worth getting cracking with it as soon as humanly possible.
And are there any statistics on what delaying starting this journey looks like? So, for example, if you're in your early 20s and you get started versus if you leave it until your 30s versus 40s, is there kind of like almost like a delay penalty if you don't get started sooner?
Yes, absolutely. And it's really quite shocking because of the way that compounding works. The money that you invest younger, you're kind of getting growth on your growth for longer. And it's like a snowball rolling down a hill. It just gets bigger and bigger. And, you've got to keep that snowball rolling. So if you're just starting in your 50s, doesn't have a huge length of time to roll. So if you take I know obviously you can't actually, nail down exactly what it's going to cost because it'll all depend on sort of investment growth. But if you were to put aside £300 a month, set your retirement age for 68, and guess kind of roughly yearly growth of maybe 7% and charges of maybe 1%. So that kind of gives you a rough rule of thumb. So someone who is 25, by the time they get to 68, they're going to have just over £715,000. So that will be sitting in their pot. If they left it for an extra 10 years, it would mean that they would have £345,000 less in their pot. If they left it till they were 45, then they would have £535,000 less. And if they left it till they were 50, their pot would be just £72,000. So I don't want to scare anyone because we're all different, and it's great to say definitely start as early as humanly possible. But if life has got in the way for you in one way or another, you might have got, say, for example, divorced in your 50s, and you might have ended up not keeping the pension in the divorce settlement, and you might be starting from scratch. And it's really important not to be put off by this because anything that you have, you will be grateful for in retirement. So it's kind of the clearest rule of thumb with pensions. There's loads of different rules of thumb that everyone comes up with that, can be helpful. But the clearest one is to do whatever you can afford to do as soon as you can afford to do it. And don't go beating yourself up if that happens a bit later in life for you.
I think it's really helpful to see that breakdown over the different milestones of starting. I think in a way it's motivating. So if you're in your early career, see the value of those contributions, no matter how small you might think they are, it's always going to add up. But I suppose once you get to those milestones as well, it's about not giving up or giving up the perspective of having that built up for you.
Yes. And it's I think, life can be really lumpy, and it particularly for women, because, if you are, for example, going to have a family, if you want to maybe work part-time for a period or take a career break or whatever it is that you plan to do, you can find that your income isn't a straightforward path, upwards throughout your entire career. And it's just worth knowing that sticking with it in any way that you possibly can makes a huge difference. And, one of the things that people think about is when they go on maternity leave, is they think, well, goodness, I'm going to need every penny I can't possibly pay into my pension. Well, if you're on maternity leave, you're paying a percentage of your maternity pay into your pension. So if you were paying, 5% of your salary, you'd be paying 5% just of that maternity pay, whereas your employer's got to keep paying in that percentage of your full salary. So they are supercharging that bit. So even if, it is a big if, because, you've got a lot of pressure on your finances at that stage. But if you can afford to keep paying in, it really is worth doing just a little bit as you go along. There was actually a piece of research out. It was done by the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and it was remarkably complicated. But the general findings were that there is a huge part-time penalty that people pay. So it looked at, the likelihood of working part-time, and they kind of basically boiled it down to people who mainly work full-time during their career and people who mainly work part-time during their career. And they found women were much more likely to fall into that mainly part-time bracket. So it's 17% of women fall into that bracket and only 2% of men. And as a result of just those working patterns, they found it made a massive difference to their retirement income. So for those who work mainly full-time, the average income is £403 a week, whereas for those who work mainly part-time, it's £219 a week. So that is a massive, massive difference. Now, what might happen is someone who's worked mainly part-time might be, married to someone who may work mainly full-time, and they might combine their finances. But even then, your lower combined finances will have an impact on your income.
That's really interesting. And with the difference between the full-time and part-time pensions outcome, is that purely down to earnings potential, or are there any situations where potentially with somebody going down to part-time hours, are they more likely to opt out of their pension? Is there any kind of data showing what might be contributing to that?
So this incredibly complicated piece of research, it did find that all of those things did play a part, but the main thing was that incomes are coming down, and so paying in a percentage of your income, it will automatically fall. So it was the difference in incomes that played the biggest role in all of it. And it's, we at AJ Bell, we've done a piece of research looking at where that happens. And it's basically around age 28, we see a diversion between what men put into their pensions and what women put into their pensions. And it's then from 28 onwards, it kind of, the gap between the two grows, because it's, it may well be that women are only part-time for a short period, but then there's the risk that they miss out on things like, pay rises and promotions and all the rest of it. And then that gap just grows. And it's not through a lack of commitment to the pension, because women are working hard to pay into their pension. It's purely because they've got less money to work with.
And for anybody who's listening who might be considering going part-time or really thinking about their finances as they've moved into a part-time working framework, what kind of steps can they take to maybe boost their pension, whether they're, single or if they are with a partner? What are some of the tips that they can use to try and just fill that gap a little bit and make sure they're maximizing everything available?
So I think it's really important for couples to, it sounds really simple, but just to have a conversation about it. Because what we can fall into patterns of is people will just say, I'll pay for this, you pay for that. And you just assume that you're in charge of your own pension payments. But when you're earning very different amounts for family reasons, so you've both got this responsibility and one of you is earning less because they've taken that responsibility on for the two of you, then it's about having a conversation around how much can we pay into both of our pensions, and looking at, how much tax relief you can get, how much each of your employers will pay in, and making sure you're maximizing all those bits and pieces as well. But it's definitely, a lot of people, it's really important to them to have their own pension provision. And so therefore having those conversations, although they are difficult to have, and, the first response of anybody in that conversation will just be, oh my goodness, we can't afford anything. It's a complete nightmare. It's kind of sitting down and having the, the maths laid out in front of you and working out ways to make it work for the two of you.
Amazing.
You mentioned also, obviously, people who go into it single. And we know that people who retire single are on much, much lower incomes than people who are part of a couple. And it can be incredibly difficult, especially if they've, particularly those who have, rather than being bereaved, have got divorced, because they don't have they haven't inherited somebody else's pension. They've usually kind of split or lost all of the pension. So in those circumstances, it's really a question of looking at other levers you can pull around the pension. So I think when we think about pensions, all we think we're in control of is the contribution. And that is a massive part of it, but it's not all there is. So you can also pull the lever of investment. So you can look at the investments within your pension and think, well, how can I make those investments work a bit harder? Particularly when you've got quite a lot of time until you retire, you might think, well, if I can look at investments that maybe are more concentrated in shares, and because normally your default fund in a pension will be a whole mixture of different things in order to sort of balance out risk and go for something nice in the middle of the road. Whereas if you're younger, you might be more comfortable thinking, well, I'll take a bit of risk while I'm younger and I've got longer. And then the other sort of lever you can pull is how and when you retire. Now, I've already said, you can't necessarily continue in your current job if your health starts to sort of suffer. But there might be types of work that you can do. And there might be it might be the case that you can stagger retirement. So you think, well, I'll keep working for one day a week, or, I'll find a role that I can manage as I get older. And so you can pull that lever as well. So I think it's really important that people, yes, definitely think about contributions and, do as much as you possibly can there. But if there's further ground to make up and you're thinking, there's no way I can do this through contributions alone, then there are these other levers you can pull as well.
That's, a really important point to consider. And I guess when looking at life generally, are there any other big events that people should kind of factor into this financial planning? So we've already taken a look at maybe if you take time out to start a family, but are there any kind of core events that people should keep in mind and maybe plan for as best as you can? Because life is, very cyclical. Things happen all the time. Some things are very unexpected, but just trying to get that framework in place. What are some of the other things that maybe people forget about?
Well, definitely, it can be difficult to concentrate on when you're younger is to think about care. So one of the issues that people have, particularly as they get into their 50s and 60s, is that they need to care for older people in the family. And because care is so expensive, a lot of families will do informal care within the family, and it will impact how much they can work and how much they can earn. And often it will be one member of a couple will either give up work or go into part-time work. And that might mean, therefore, that often it's the woman who ends up doing that, because from a purely mathematical basis, it's often the woman who's earning less. And so the fact that, you're giving up less income. But on the other side of things, there's a huge cultural element of this. Having had a parent who needed care, there was a huge assumption that it was going to be the daughters and the daughters-in-law and all that sort of thing who did the lion's share of the caring. So you need to think about caring for older family members. And then if you're planning to work later in life, even if you're in good health, you need to think about the health of your partner. So especially in age gap relationships where you can have a partner who's significantly older, who needs care while you're still working age, you need to think about, how will I manage that? And will I be able to keep working? And do I need to plan for finishing work a little bit earlier? I mean, it's again, in those age gap relationships, there's loads of interesting conversations you need to have, because if one of you is going to get to state pension age 10 years before the other, how do you want to manage that? Do you want to save more so you can both retire together? Do you want to think of your retirement in sort of two blobs, one of which, the older person's on their own for a bit, and then the other one where you join together and do more fun things? So there's a whole heap of discussions you need to have around that. But, I think one of the key bits of this is to have the conversations really early. And they're not just conversations of how much is it going to cost to live in retirement? It's how do we want to live in retirement? And those things can really lay the foundations of your planning.
Absolutely. I think making sure that you're on the same page when it comes to those things is so important. Are there any kind of top level tips on how to even start this conversation? Because I think although money is becoming slightly more, or people are becoming a little bit more comfortable talking about money, there is that element of taboo and not necessarily feeling that empowered in how to even begin these discussions, especially if you're, say, bridging two lives together. So do you have any kind of top tips on how to even start the conversation?
Well, I think we're sort of coming up to summer holiday time of year, and I would say that it's actually a really great time to have sort of low stress conversations. So when you're away and you're doing nothing, you can, it's quite easy to bring up the whole, I fancy doing a lot of this in my retirement. What about you? Kind of thing. It's quite easy to have those conversations. I would also say one of the most successful ways to have conversations is side by side rather than face to face. So if you're sitting facing someone, it can feel more confronting. Whereas if you're side by side, it just feels like you're under less pressure when you're sort of facing difficult topics. So it means rather than starting a conversation over dinner, you might have conversations you go for a walk or, going for a drive or something like that, where you're kind of taking the pressure off each other. And therefore it just gives you a little bit more freedom to kind of explore slightly harder topics.
That sounds really good. I think it also normalizes it by making it part of a just normal activity rather than, okay, we're going to have this formal sit down at the table, get all the files out and everything. I think just making it a bit more natural definitely helps, and hopefully just puts people at ease when it comes to really being open about what they see life being like. Because I guess, planning for retirement, planning your finances and everything, it's about what you want to achieve and then just finding the ways to get there. And if you haven't had the chance to think about it, it's totally fine. Life gets very messy. We don't always get the chance to sit down and be like, this is what I want. Am I on the track to get there? But I really like that suggestion of, making it more comfortable, just making it a bit more natural and see where the conversation goes.
And starting with the fun aspect of it first. What do we want? How do we want to live? What's the lifestyle stuff that sounds really cool? Rather than starting with the maths, which will immediately throw you into sort of sense of, oh my goodness, are we doing enough? What can we do more? Panic, I don't understand. Actually just starting with the reality of this could be really cool.
This episode of the Investing Insiders podcast is sponsored by Saxo Markets. Saxo provides access to a broad range of global assets through a sophisticated trading platform. You can trade US stocks from as little as $1 per trade and UK stocks from $3 per trade. Please remember that all investing involves risk. The value of your investments can go down as well as up, and you could get back less than you invest. Terms and conditions apply. Visit Saxo Markets to learn more. So I guess when you're thinking about financial planning, especially if you're in the early stages of it, I love the idea of thinking about what you want and I guess kind of working backwards. So you've got a rough goal and you see what you need to put in place to get there. Whether you're the type of person that sits down with a piece of paper or, you've got your notes app, or maybe you have a Pinterest board or something like that. What are some of the things that you should be thinking about in the early stages of financial planning to make sure that you're, getting yourself on the right track?
So I think it's sort of when you're very early days and retirement feels like a long, long way away, it is, it sounds straightforward, but making a start is the most important bit, and doing it in a way that you're doing as much as you can, but you're not overstretching yourself to the extent that you're thinking that you might damage other bits of your finances. So it's more in the very early days, it's less about necessarily having a specific goal on a specific date and you're working towards it. It's more about just doing whatever you can. I think as you go through, the years, then it gets a bit more real, it gets a bit closer, you get a bit more of an understanding about, any ups and downs that you've had in your income through your life. And then you sort of start to plan a little bit more specifically towards a financial goal. And I think those conversations, the sort of that we were sort of talking about, the kind of the when do you want to retire? When you get to the sort of 40s, 50s, 60s, actually thinking about when would work for me. Do I want to retire early, or actually do I like work? And do I want to phase retirement? Because it's increasingly common, and it's I think if people focus on getting the joy out of whatever work it is that they can do, then it feels less like an onerous, oh goodness, I've got to work forever, and more a sort of, well, actually, this is a really useful way for me to kind of keep socializing and for me to have that extra money that I might be able to spend on holidays, and, to focus on those sorts of positives. And then it's the sort of, where do you want to live? So, I think a lot of people will have sort of vague ideas about where they want to live, but it's kind of, well, how much does property around there cost? What sort of property could we afford? Are we downsizing to get there? Are we actually upsizing now to afford where we want to live? There's lots of conversations to have around that. And if you are going to downsize, there's the conversation around when do you want to do it? So do you want to do it right at the beginning of retirement, make loads of sort of friends by the sea, do it that way? Or do you want to stay where you are, where all your friends and family are, and move later when it's going to be more isolating to move because you're sort of maybe less mobile, less able to get out, but you've had all that long period of time around friends and family. So you kind of, basically the right answer to that will depend very much on your own circumstances, but making sure you've thought about it will lead you to your right answer. And then the last thing is the whole lifestyle element of it. So, some people will want really active lifestyles, doing loads, going traveling, spending loads of money, and will need a lot of money to make it work. And I think some people won't. And so when you look at the sort of, the definition of moderate, comfortable, all those sorts of definitions of retirement, they're based around other people's needs. So you really need to think about what your needs are. And, I think often when we think about retirement, the first bit of retirement is the bit we focus on. We think, oh yeah, I can't wait to stop work and, go off and caravan around the world or whatever. And we don't sort of think, well, actually, when we're 90, what do we want to do? And our needs will change throughout retirement, and our income needs as a result will change. And it's kind of you don't have to plot it down to the final pence, but just having an idea of what that might cost and whether you're on track for it is really useful.
It is kind of like a North Star that you can work towards. And one thing that I've really liked that you said is, thinking about retirement as a moving thing, like it's not something that's fixed. Once you move into that phase of life, things can change. So, you could phase retirement, you could go traveling. There are lots of options available. I suppose, like when thinking about retirement and the ways in which it can change and how much income you might be taking at any one time might differ. For anybody who's thinking about phasing in retirement, what does that look like? And what types of things do they need to be aware of, especially, I suppose, looking at tax and stuff like that too?
Yeah, so there are lots of decisions you can make around your retirement date and when you take bits of income. So one of the things that often happens is that people will move down tax brackets in retirement. And then there's a bunch of different things you can do from a tax perspective that are really useful. So, for example, if you are putting money to your savings account and you're 5 years from retirement, you could think, well, actually, if I put it into an account that pays out at the end of that 5 years, it could pay out at the point at which I'm a lower taxpayer, and therefore more of my savings interest will be tax-free. So there's loads of bits and bobs you can do around that. Obviously, how you take your retirement income, if you're taking a lump sum from your pension, you really need to think about making sure that you're not doing it in a way that means you're taxed really heavily. And one thing that can be incredibly useful is having not just your pension, but also having ISAs alongside it, which helps you kind of draw the most tax efficient income possible. So you kind of, you might find you're drawing some from your pension, you're earning some money, and it might take you really near if you're very lucky, really near the high rate tax threshold. And you might think, well, and also I need to buy a car, but I can take that money from my ISA, and therefore I don't have to push myself into paying high rate tax. So there's kind of having those options makes life a bit more flexible. I would say that, how you draw an income is another big decision that people make. And that totally depends on, their own needs and their own kind of priorities. So you've got a few choices. You can buy an annuity, which is basically where you hand over a lump sum and you get a sort of monthly income in return, and that lasts for life. Or you can draw down, which basically means that you take money as and when from your pension, or you can do a bit of both. And a lot of people do a bit of both so that they kind of have the absolute basics covered by an annuity income, and then they can kind of flex around whether or not they, what often happens is early doors, when you're working, you think, well, I'll have a low annuity income. Working, I'll draw from, here and there if I need it. And then when you get sort of closer to, maybe your 70s or 80s, you might think, well, I don't need that much more flexibility. When you get older, the annuity rates tend to be better. So you might think, well, I'll annuitize a bit more of my pension pot so I can then kind of have a reliable income and I don't have to sort of think about how I'm going to maximize that. So those decisions will, of course, affect how much money you need in your pension pot and when you need that money. And kind of, so for example, the day before you buy an annuity, you should have everything in very low risk assets.
Right. Okay.
Whereas the day before you start drawdown, you're going to have a mixture because some of that drawdown stuff you're going to need tomorrow and some of that drawdown stuff you're not going to need for 20 years. So it's kind of how you draw an income is another really big decision that you need to make fairly early on so that you can sort of plan towards having the right money in the right places at the point you retire.
And when thinking about that, what kind of age should you start, or what kind of age would it be wise to start thinking about how your retirement income might break down? So, getting an idea about how annuities work, thinking about, whether you want to draw down. When is an ideal time to start thinking about that?
Well, the government offers something called Pensions Wise, which is a sort of a service where they'll just talk you through all your options. And that's free for anyone aged 50 and over. And that's kind of a decent indication that around the age of 50 is a good time. You don't necessarily have to make any big movements around then, but actually having a sort of sketching out a rough idea of what you sort of want to do is really, really helpful. Because then if you're, the thing that can be very helpful is when it's known as de-risking, but basically moving your pension investments into less risky assets. It's helpful to be able to do that slowly. You don't want to do any big sudden movements because then timing the market becomes an issue. You want to be able to do that gradually over time so that it doesn't matter when you do it. It's just sometimes it will be a great time to do it, sometimes it will be a less great time to do it, and everything just even out and come out in the wash. So I think it's making those early decisions and then sort of planning slowly towards them. Having said that, if life changes and throws you up in the air in the middle of nowhere, then obviously, as life changes, you can end up rethinking what you're doing. And that's the other thing I would say is we've talked a lot about what your plans are for retirement, and you absolutely need a plan A, definitely. But life will catch you out in one way or another somewhere along the line. And that's when you need a plan B. And plan B is a lot less kind of formal around, I need to put this much into my pension and I want to withdraw it in this way. It's much more, what else can I do if life changes and catches me out? Can I downsize? Do I want to use equity release? Could I move in with the kids? There's a bunch of different options that can come up for plan B. And it's really kind of looking at exploring all of those in advance so that if life catches you out, you're not suddenly thrown into a massive disaster. You go, right, okay, I know what I'm going to do here because I've already made a plan.
And having that safety net in a way is really liberating, because it does go to show that it's okay if things don't necessarily go exactly how you've mapped out. There are other options, and there's always going to be some way to, bring yourself back to hopefully where you want to be. Thinking about property within, somebody's pension planning, a lot of the time, some of the conversations that come up are, do I prioritize getting on the property ladder, or do I maximize my pensions contributions? With property being such a, valuable asset a lot of the time, does it make sense to prioritize home ownership, I guess at any stage really, to make sure that that's not a cost that you have to keep thinking about when you hit retirement? Or what does that look like when somebody's thinking about their future and how they want to bring that together?
It's a really, really tough question, especially for younger people, because I think, I talk to people who've given up on ever owning a property because they just think it's not fair and they're never going to get there. Why bother and just enjoy life? And I can completely understand how they've made that decision. I think if you do make that decision, you then, as you say, you have to know how you're going to pay for a roof over your head in retirement. And if you don't have enough money to do that, then obviously you're going to be reliant on the state to help you. And so, that might be the way that you end up going, but it's something where you have to think about what that means for your lifestyle. So I personally think that the best approach is for you to work out what the necessities are in life and what the nice to haves are. And then at various times, you're going to prioritize some of those necessities over others. But there should be a straight line throughout your life of you thinking about those necessities. So your pension is going to be a necessity, your property is going to be a necessity. There should be a straight line. So sometimes you're going to put a lot more into your property because you've got, I don't know, massive mortgage. And then there are times when you're going to put less into your property because you paid the mortgage down a bit. So it's going to ebb and flow over time. But if you just think of them as these sort of lines of payments that will just go throughout your life, then you don't ever think, because you can get into all or nothing thinking where people can say, I need to put everything into paying off my mortgage. And that's, again, understandable because it would clear a big blob of worry out of your mind. But actually, you're neglecting other areas of your finance. And it's the little and often approach to literally everything that will get you to where you need to get to in the end.
I think, thinking about everything as a balance, rather than, you have to focus on this and then you focus on that. it all kind of works together. So I guess maybe more of a proportional consideration of all these things might help, especially with relieving some of that psychological stress of, okay, I have to do this and then I'll move on to that. You can kind of balance things slightly more and just make yourself feel a little less stressed about it.
Yes, and it's I think it's so psychologically, it's something that's patterned that we fall into in every aspect of our life. I mean, I only have to look at my social media. For ages, everybody on my social media was obsessed with protein, and then they're obsessed with fiber, and then they're obsessed with eating 84 fruits a day or whatever it is, and then it's going to the gym and lifting. It's kind of recognizing that there will be things that are the shiny, bright, lovely thing of the moment. But actually, fundamentally, it's the balanced diet that underpins the lot, and occasionally getting up and moving around, and just do the financial equivalent of that. A little bit of this, a little bit of that, and not getting carried away will take you through. It is obviously, I would also say everybody makes mistakes, and I think, again, similarly with health and exercise, you can think, oh, I've eaten a curry, I'm doomed, I'm never moving again. Or you can think, oh, I've eaten a curry, well, never mind, I'll go to the gym tomorrow. Well, actually, that might be unpleasant for everyone in the gym, but you kind of, it's not thinking it's game over, I've ruined everything. It's getting back on track and just doing the right things, as often as you can. I think the other thing that one of the traps people could fall into is, if they're lucky enough to be able to expect an inheritance, is to kind of think about that as their get out of jail free card. So people might think, oh, I've neglected this, but don't worry, I'm going to inherit further down the line and everything will be fine. And it's really important. I mean, yes, inheritance can make a huge difference to people. But unless you're getting that inheritance early, unless somebody is saying to you, I'm going to give this money to you during my lifetime so you can crack on, you cannot rely on that inheritance. So there are things that can dramatically change. You're I don't know, if you're relying on a parent to give to you, they might get married to someone who's like 30 years younger than, and leave everything to them. You have no idea how life's going to pan out. They could have huge care needs, and therefore there is no inheritance. So if you've built your life thinking, oh, I can worry about that later because I'm expecting to inherit, then it's really important to have a plan that involves not inheriting as well. So that if you do have a change that you weren't expecting, it doesn't completely undermine all your plans so far.
Absolutely. I think it almost maps onto that idea of, there are like two buckets. There's things inside your control and things outside of your control. And I suppose inheritance is a little bit outside of your control. You can control your budget, you can control the plan that you have and changing directions and things like that. But I suppose not putting too much emphasis on what, you don't really have any influence over is quite important.
Yes, absolutely. And it's one of the reasons why, when you're doing all of these plans, yes, absolutely plan it with the state pension in mind, but also know where you're going to stand if something changes with the state pension. Because no one said anything is going to happen to the state pension, but it's just, this is a state benefit and those aren't written in stone. So you absolutely cannot guarantee that it'll be exactly the same when you get there. So definitely plan both ways and optimistically hope that the state pension will still be intact when you get to retirement. But just think about all the other options if state pensions change and how you're going to roll with those punches.
Amazing. And I think one of the things that I love that you said is that if, you have your plan and it doesn't quite go as you expect, it doesn't mean that it derails everything. So for anybody who's listening, who's thinking, I've either left it a bit too late or, I thought that I was on track, but I've just checked, my retirement pots and it's just not giving what I was hoping it would. What are some of the tips they can take away from this just to make sure that, they don't fall into that doom and gloom thinking and, giving up entirely?
Well, I think you could do a couple of things. So one of the easiest things to do is, when you go into a pensions calculator and it looks dicey, is to make even relatively small changes to how much you put away, because you will be pleasantly surprised by how that will add up over time. And if you can't make those changes today, it's making a pledge for them tomorrow. So, hopefully over time you will get pay rises, you might get a bonus, there might be lump sums that and committing to a percentage of all of those things puts you in a position that you will automatically be putting more into your pension as you go along. And you don't have to find that money today. It'll kind of give you a bit of a leg up as you go along. And I think another big part of it is doing the calculations as to how you want to live. It can make a massive difference, because it's really easy to assume that the money you need to live today is the money you will need to live in retirement. And looking actually a bit more closely and thinking, do I really need, well, I won't be commuting, so I don't need that money. And I won't be paying the rent or the mortgage, so I don't need that money. And actually doing the maths, and it will, for a lot of people, it will be a huge relief that they don't need as much money as they'd worried they might.
Well, I think that's a huge relief, as you say, because sometimes it can just feel like, oh my gosh, how is this gigantic sum of money going to come together and be enough? But it does sound like there are so many different options, and it's really important to think about retirement, pensions, and things like that as this moving part, almost as if you were working. So, you have your career, you might change jobs and whatever, but it's all still working together, and you can still make contributions and make use of the accounts that you were mentioning before. So looking at ISAs and things like that as well, just to make sure you're on track. Like, it's not an all or nothing approach, but you do have to do something to get something out.
But it can be very inspiring talking to people who've found solutions. So it can really help. I mean, I talk to people who have got to retirement and been quite surprised that things haven't worked out they wanted to. And then, I know one of them, for example, she's taken in a student to live in her spare room. And it's actually great company as well as a decent income stream. And then, another one who she's got a van that she lives in for a couple of months a year and Airbnbs her house out. So she gets to travel around Europe, and she also gets to have another income stream. So there are actually, if you're in this position, because it's really tempting to be overwhelmed by the fear and the doom and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
And actually talking to some inspirational people who are doing things with their retirement that they weren't expected to do, but they're loving it, that can really help as well.
Amazing. Well, Sarah, thank you so much. These have been some incredible gems during the episode. And I think it's definitely helped put this retirement planning and financial planning generally into perspective. It's not like a hard and fast goal that doesn't change. It's having that kind of plan and being flexible enough when things do come up, but just making sure you're on, the right track generally.
Yes. And personally, I did leave a big blob of the middle of my life when I didn't pay enough into my pension. And, now I'm paying an enormous chunk of my salary into my pension. But it's knowing that, even people who do this for a living aren't perfect. So you don't have to be perfect either. You just have to keep going.
Oh, well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining our Investing Insiders podcast. If you like the episode, please subscribe and leave us a 5-star review on your platform of choice. For the latest money news and deals, you can sign up to our weekly newsletter at investinginsiders.co.uk/newsletter-page. We've also got a suite of guides, tools, and calculators on our website at investinginsiders.co.uk. You can also keep up to date with us on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you in the next episode.